turn it on. Is this on now? I think this is the way I would respond, in addition to what Peter said, is that we would expect any actions taken to follow what the Delta Plan says is best available science and adaptive management. And it mirrors the recommendation that we made when the commission, the Fish and Game Commission, was handling this. And we at the council, and you adopted this letter saying, sure, go ahead, and the council supported taking those actions, but only if they documented their conceptual model for why the proposed actions would have the intended effect and where the uncertainties are, and then had also established the appropriate monitoring and evaluation program to address those uncertainties during implementation. So I think we want to we'd respond the same way we would with any action, is let's make sure that they don't just go out and someone comes up with a great idea and goes out and implements. They really need to take that time to do that homework, we think. I mean, if this came to us as a covered action, that's what we would expect. So I think there's...
Who needs to do the homework?
Whoever it is that's proposing to take the action. We call them proponents. Whoever's coming forward and saying, here's the action we think should be taken, we expect them to document their rationale.
I mean, technically speaking, the covered action process commences after September 1, although we have no idea when a state or local agency will first make a determination that a project is a covered action. But let's just assume for purposes of discussion that somebody makes that determination in November 2013. I have no idea where, what it would be. Just imagine that's the case. Our regulations on covered actions include requirements that they illustrate the use of best available science and an adaptive management plan. At what point may they read the Delta Science Plan to see what our scientists have thought ought to be included in their consideration?
This also matches what Chris Knopp was talking about earlier in terms of the training for consistency determination. So what we're...
Lauren,
okay.
You're going to go out there and all those people, they're going to be land developers, they're going to be city and county officials, they're going to be planners, they're going to be engineers. They say, well, what in the hell do you want me to do?
Well,
And I want to know when the science side is prepared to say, look, we can't dictate to you everything you do, but here at least is our judgment of what an adaptive management scheme, the elements that are contained within it, the status given to issue, the exam. I mean, can we read the second draft and determine that? I understand it has no regulatory effect,
right,
but it certainly has an informative effect because it comes from the best scientist we have available to us opining on these things. Now, the problem I got is, this follows up Randy's question. I read this as not a Delta Science Plan, but as a process to hopefully develop a Delta Science Plan. I hope I'm wrong. Because the meetings, the consultation, the committees, the identification of big issues, the identification, all are to follow. Am I correct?
Well, we see that this is a plan that we will begin implementing. Well, we actually think we're already implementing portions of it. But
for I don't know, somebody with a project in November, December of 2013, they're going to say, "What do you want me? What do you think we should do?"
Yeah. Well, let me
answer
that question. So what we're working on, and we can get this into the next draft of the Delta Science Plan. What we have in the current draft is Appendix F, which is the guidelines for adaptive management. What we're also working on for this training is what are the guidelines for best available science, which is the other component of GP1. And we're putting that together right now, since we're going to be starting that training actually next week. And what are the elements that need to be considered per the regulation? So in the regulation, there's Appendix 1A and Table 1A-1 that outlines I think it's 6 criteria for best available science. And I'm going to do this from memory, but it's objectivity, transparency, relevance, timeliness, peer review. I may have missed one. So that, by the regulation, the proponents have to document how they have utilized the best available science for each of those criteria. That's what the documentation will entail. So we are putting together guidance for that portion as well, and we certainly, I think, could get that into the next version of the Delta Science Plan. But what we think makes the most sense is for them to do that through something that looks similar to a research grant proposal, because from our experience, research grant proposals have to include all of that documentation. So it's really up to proponents how they present it. We can't dictate that. But certainly if we get...
Okay, but here's the adaptive management guidelines. You've got 9 steps or elements or something. I don't know. Okay, our suggested guidelines for each of the 9 steps of the Delta Plan Adaptive Management. This is Appendix F. I mean, just pulling one out. Model linkage, establish goals and objectives. Somebody's going to say, well, give me an example of the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a plan. And we'd say, you tell us what you think, we'll tell you if you're wrong.
Well,
that can't be what we're doing.
No, I think, well, if you want to go ahead, I think what outlines why we think we need to have adaptive management liaisons that can help people develop their adaptive management plans, because they've got to be customized for each project. There are
no common elements in any of them?
Well, there are common elements, but, I mean, we've been involved in this camped effort that Peter's referred to, the Collaborative Adaptive Management Plan. And we have folks there that certainly know about adaptive management, but from my experience, they still need help in putting this together. It is not
last month you
straightforward.
had Dr. Wiens here to talk to us about adaptive management, best available, the same kinds of questions. And he said, well, not every project
right.
should or could have adaptive management in it. Okay,
That's right.
That's a fair statement. That seems to make sense to me. But I don't know what the measures are. How do you know whether it does or doesn't? I suppose a really big, gigantic, monstrous project might, by prima facie, say, well, yeah, you ought to have something. But what isn't?
Well,
what doesn't require?
Yeah, I can tell you, he showed a figure. I don't know if you recall the figure, but it had 2 axes. One was uncertainty. So where are the knowledge gaps, scientific knowledge gaps?
Yeah.
And then the other axis was controllability. Is there a management action that we could take to manage it? If there isn't, so where adaptive management is most important, or is appropriate, I should say, is where there's high uncertainty and high controllability. So, for example, you wouldn't need to take adaptive management if there's 100% certainty that taking an action will achieve an outcome. You don't need to do adaptive management, just do it. Don't spend any time on it. On the other hand, if there's no hope, really, that human beings can do anything to tweak the system and change it with any, within reason, then that's also not appropriate for adaptive management. Nature sometimes overrules what we can do.
Well, okay, who is going to be an adaptive management liaison, as you recommend in Appendix H?
Well, I think we have examples right now on our staff. Chris Enright.
Okay. And will there be other people in addition to Chris who, I could understand. That's the first thing I say. I say, okay, Chris Enright's tentatively identified as a adaptive management liaison. There could be others within the science program available for projects. I got that. Do you intend to have other liaisons? outside the Delta Science program?
Outside the Delta. Well, I think the action in the Delta Science plan is about Delta Science program adaptive management liaisons, and I'm envisioning we will need several, probably on the order of 4 or 5 at least. But yes, certainly there are folks in the agencies out there that are also in charge of doing adaptive management or planning for adaptive management within their home agency, and those are the folks we'll work with. It's also part of the forum, the Adaptive Management Forum. This was a recommendation from our ISB members.
Well, I have
training
very high
folks.
regard for Chris Enright, and I have absolutely no doubt that his professional judgment, skill, and talent is going to lead to a miles better project for anyone. How do we know that the other people who will be performing the same roles, Appendix H says it's going to be multiple liaisons, not just a single person, are applying the same standards and judgments? I mean,
actually, can I step in there, Phil? Because these are really good questions. I think there's really 2 time frames. If someone comes to you in September or October, right now, these are the standards and the guidelines which are being developed right now, but we know the elements that we would want to see. So, for example, where we've heard the SFEI developing those guidelines right now, we want to see the conceptual models. We need to see deterministic models if the scale of the project is, a reasonable size.
okay, got that. Is there any guidance to anyone on what reasonable size means? Because this is not a regulation. I'm not asking, we understand this is not amending our regulatory capacity. It is explaining the professional judgment of our scientific staff. And if that's the case, what do you guys think is a reasonable subject or project or plan? I mean, there's got to be something other than conferences, meetings, and so on. I mean, we're going through a training session. Mm-hmm. These questions will come up. You will have to either say, we don't know yet, or it's clear from the material we've already written, or something.
Well, I think we anticipate, maybe, Chris, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, let me jump in for just a second, because we've had this discussion several times in the past week. And one of the things that, Phil, that's come out of this is some advice from Chris Stevens on this issue. And his comment was, at this point, when you're determining whether or not a proponent has an acceptable adaptive management program, one that's consistent, because we have to make that determination. We have to go back to the chapter in the Delta plan that describes it. And when you look at that, you go back to the list of items that Lauren had mentioned earlier, and they're a little unsatisfactory. They're not explicit. Is it relevant science? What were the other pieces of that?
Objectivity and transparency, peer review, timeliness.
Yeah, none of them lists some things that perhaps I would like to see in there that are much more explicit, that would nail down whether or not it's an acceptable adaptive management program. But I think where we're at today is we are left with what ultimately is a qualitative decision by the science team on adaptive management based on the criteria that exist today.
Which in science is not uncommon.
Let me remove it from the covered action stuff. What if somebody comes in with an early consultation? Maybe that's a better thing. Early consultation, no determination. What do you guys think? That's probably what a professional. What do you think? And you're going to sit around and the engineers are going to say, well, here's what I think as an engineer, and the biological science are going to say that's what it is, and Rainer's going to say, well, my experience in this means you ought to do this, and Jessica Davenport's going to say, I'm a planner, here's what I think. I got all that, but that seems to me to be a really important process. This is the early consultation, and I'm interested in how you're going to approach that. Forget the regulatory stuff and covered action. Just forget that. It's the early consultations. What do you think?
Right. Well, what I'm expecting is that we'll ask people to come in and bring us whatever they have, we'll talk about it. We want to know what is their project all about. We want to help them, take them through each of the steps. What is the problem they're trying to solve? What are their objectives of the project? What's their conceptual model for why taking that action will help? What have they put together thus far in terms of science support for that? And we'll help them put it together.
Let me ask a more pointed question. Are we going to have standards for data compatibility, for accessibility of data, for use of conceptual models to design the program, for standards for the quality of the overall scientific design? Is that going to be part of an adaptive management advisory capacity to these proponents?
Sure. And I see that as part of, we certainly don't have that as part of the current regulation. But that's one of the reasons why we're recommending putting together these adaptive management frameworks in the Delta Science Plan, because one of the main purposes for that is to get this common approach. Because what we don't want is someone doing a project in the North Delta and someone doing one in Sassoon Marsh and someone doing one somewhere else, because they actually will all affect each other, through the water movement. And so we want to try to get people to use this common approach and to think of be aware of and think of what other folks are doing as well. And so that gets at some of those standards I think you're talking about. This landscape scale conceptual model and the other aspects of the framework are going to get at that. And then I think it will be the case that we're going to look for people to follow those standards and follow those frameworks. Hopefully we get buy-in along the way from the development, because again, they're not part of the regulation today.